What's up, everybody? I'm gonna kick this off a couple minutes early. I know the streams are supposed to start at 9:15. It's 9:13. Oh well, I'm getting tired of sitting here waiting for nothing to happen. Uh, I have a pretty short stream to say today, talking about some technology, a Zitay CFExpress to M.2 flash adapter thingy for more cheap storage in your cameras, and the big one from this week has been Sony's announcement of the Alpha One, uh, or the Alpha A1, or whatever they're calling it. But anyway, I'm going to just dive into this. I don't think this is going to be a tremendously long stream, but it is what it is. So let's get started. So I got an email from a friend of mine last week, early last week, I think, asking about what this Zitay, Z-I-T-A-Y is the name of the company, thing was. And it's a compact flash or CFExpress adapter with a cord that you put an M.2 SSD into. And I don't know what to think about this. I think it's really cool in one respect that cameras have gotten to a point with technology where there's so much compatibility or cross compatibility with the technology being used, the underlying technology being used, that like bog standard computer stuff can be used in cameras, with cameras. So CFExpress uses the PCI Express bus for the physical communication and the NVMe protocol for storing information on the card. And that's the same thing that's used on your motherboard, in your computer, for your, PCI Express for like your video card, and then NVMe and PCI Express essentially for M.2 SSDs. So the SSDs pretty much all modern computers are using at this point, not the larger older SATA ones. And I think it's pretty cool. I mean, that's not to say that computers haven't used, or cameras haven't used similar technology. Compact flash cards, which my 5D Mark IVs are, still use. That's their primary or their fastest storage medium, is parallel ATA. It's the same physical connection protocol, electrical thing that hard drives used in the late 90s and early 2000s before they moved to serial ATA. And, that was, well, I guess that was a little bit of a crossover, right? But the problem for example, in the case of like compact flash cards, is in most cameras, they weren't being used in parallel ATA mode. They were being used in a compact flash card mode that was similar, at least this is my understanding, it was similar, but not quite the same. Whereas, and of course, SD cards, which everybody's probably familiar with, is an entirely proprietary protocol for SD cards. It's not like it's a repurposing of USB or something into a fancy thing that plugs into your camera. And, it's kind of cool, like I said, that we've gotten to a point where more and more of the mainstream camera technology is built on the broader technology of the computer industry. Hopefully, what that may mean is that, for example, CFExpress cards, which are still ungodly expensive, may become cheaper because they're much more similar to fairly inexpensive, what have become fairly inexpensive NVMe, PCI Express, M.2, like NAND flash, solid state drives. And, so you have this, hopefully there's going to be that technology cross-pollination, and it'll bring our costs down, hopefully. Now, obviously, CFExpress cards are much smaller than an M.2 flash drive, and so that is going to be a confounding factor. It's going to keep the cost of CFExpress cards high. But it is kind of cool that there's now of the ability, really, and I never really thought about this when I was looking, thinking about cameras, thinking about CFExpress and so forth. There's this it's kind of cool that there's this ability to sort of piggyback on computer stuff. And so I don't quite follow the point of maybe, or yeah, I guess that's kind of how to put it. The point of this CFExpress to M.2 adapter. The only place I see it really being valuable is in, say, shooting, for example, on a Canon R5, 8K raw footage. 4K 60, 4K 30, well, maybe 4K 60, but like, or 4K 120 in the case of the R5. But 4K 120 and 8K raw require the use of the CFExpress card. And I'm not entirely sure about 4K 60 off the top of my head. All the other ones, everything else you can save to an SD card. And so, to me, I can sort of see the value of it in the sense that, like, at least coming from my perspective, in the sense that, you can buy a 1 terabyte Samsung 970 EVO SSD for like $100, and you stick it in this thing, and now you have a 1 terabyte solid state drive that's running at essentially CFExpress speeds, so you can record 8K footage to it. Where I'm not entirely sure about the point is the sort of all the compromises that come with this. So you can't close the card door on your camera. They have a little rubber thing that pushes in the micro switch and bypasses it, but it's still, the card door isn't closed, which to me means, well, first of all, your camera's no longer weather sealed. May not be a big deal. Second of all, it means that you can't really use the grip because the door can't be closed all the way, and if you're holding it, you're also going to be putting pressure on the door, and you're really likely to break the door. So it's not a still photography thing as far as I'm concerned. It's a video thing. It's a video thing that's intended for you to have the camera in a cage of some sort or whatnot. And of course, if you're talking about a mirrorless camera, so the R5 or whatnot, you're still limited to whatever thermal limits and record time limits that the camera manufacturer has put in place. So yeah, you can have a huge pile of storage, but you don't necessarily, that doesn't translate directly to, oh, and you can record indefinitely. Now, of course, Zitay, it's not just for the R5. You could use it in a C300 Mark III or C500 Mark II. You can use it in, basically anything that uses a CFExpress card. So they have a Type A, which would work in Sony stuff. They have a Type B, which would work in Canon or Nikon cameras. And, it's not, so, like, I mean, there's options, right? But like I said, I guess I don't really see the point. I mean, it's interesting. And if it wasn't a $220 purchase, which is maybe the biggest impediment to me personally, if it wasn't $220 for the adapter plus the cost of a solid state drive, so, say $150 for a 970 Pro Samsung or 970 EVO Samsung SSD, I wouldn't mind, say, picking up one just to play with. I think it would be kind of interesting to, I don't know, experiment with, for lack of a better word. I don't think I'd actually want to use it in production because, well, if I'm shooting in the field, I tend to want my camera to be dust and weather sealed. And I don't tend to work, because I'm primarily a still guy. I don't tend to have my cameras in like full cages and where I could ensure that everything that, that card door being open would be fully protected. So I don't really, I don't really see the point there. Zitay talks about using it with the Blackmagic pocket cinema cameras. Presumably they're talking about a CFast or SATA version, because the cinema camera, Blackmagic cinema cameras are still using CFast. They're not using CFExpress. But I fail to really understand the point in that, because the newest Blackmagic cinema cameras, the pocket cinema cameras and the Ursa Minis, you can plug a USB-C hard drive into them and record to that. And you don't even need to spend 200 plus on an adapter. You just buy a regular old generic USB Type-C. Like, you could just buy a USB-C solid state drive and plug it into the camera. And so, like, I don't see the value there, for example. There's also, like, they talk about, well, you know, you could use it with the 1DX Mark III or the C300 Mark III or the C500 Mark II. And I just don't see that. Like, maybe it's just me, but we're talking about $7,000 to $16,000 cameras when you're talking about those cameras. And I really can't see somebody who's spending that much money on the camera and, you know, potentially needing to have a, you know, with support problems, or have to get support if there's a problem or whatnot, like from Canon, that wouldn't be willing to buy the actual storage. That, yes, a 1 terabyte CFExpress Type B card is like $800, and you know, that's a lot of money if you're talking about like a novice YouTube, you know, someone on YouTube just getting started, or somebody like me on YouTube with 120 something subscribers or something like that. Like, putting $800 out to buy a 1 terabyte CFExpress card, or multiple 1 terabyte CFExpress cards, that's a big ask. But then I'm not shooting these on $16,000 videos on $16,000 cameras either. And if I'm doing video with, say, a C500 Mark II at $16,000 and change dollars, there's a really good chance that it's not just a live stream hobby project on YouTube. The reality is it's probably something being done professionally, in which case, you know, I'm going to want a fully supported solution. And quite honestly, I can build into the cost of doing the job the cost of the storage, whether I have to rent the storage or buy the storage or do whatever. And, you know, just the wear on the storage, I could build that into the thing. It's like, it's really a neat idea, I think, in some respects, but I kind of also don't really see the point. But you know, like I said, if it wasn't quite as expensive, it was a $50 thing, which I don't see why it couldn't. I mean, there's no electronics in it as far as I can tell. I mean, I could be wrong, but I can't see why they would need electronics in it, because everything's getting fed, you know, PCI Express, you know, is just being routed essentially to, you know, to a wire to the M.2 SSD, instead of being like, it shouldn't need to be translated. It shouldn't need to be processed or anything like that. So, like I said, it seems expensive to me for basically a fake CFExpress card, a wire, and a housing to put a 1 terabyte, or not a 1 terabyte, a housing to put an M.2 SSD in. But I did think it was kind of like, the more I've thought about this, the more I've kind of found myself going, it is kind of an interesting thing. Like, it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting thought. It would be, I think, more interesting to me if the camera companies would allow you to write out video over the USB port. Like, Blackmagic does that. And I don't know if it would be, you know, such a big, hard process to have Canon do that kind of thing in, say, the R5 and put, you know, a way to like plug a solid state portable hard drive or whatever into the USB-C port and just dump the, you know, video, whether it was 4K, 8K raw, whatever, didn't matter. Instead of outputting it to the flash card, output it over the USB port and just, you know, let us use a USB solid state drive to store it. I mean, we can already, like, you can connect, I don't know. That might not be possible because of the host and stuff, but I think I would personally rather see something like that, and I would probably buy something like that, honestly, that for my Canon cameras, than trying to kludge this thing in. But anyway, like I said, interesting thought. So that brings me to the big, I guess, topic of the week, which was Sony announced the Alpha A1. And I got to be upfront about this. I got to be upfront. I don't like Sony. I don't like Sony as a company. I don't like the way they've done business in the past. I'm biased against Sony. So I'm certainly not going to be the person to sing praises of Sony cameras or Sony gear, or like, I'm not sure I wouldn't quit doing photography before I bought Sony equipment. Now, I'm not saying like I won't buy anything Sony. That's not really true. And they manufacture a whole lot of stuff. So like, I'm not like completely blind to the fact that there's probably Sony parts in my Canon cameras, just controllers or something, who knows. Like, they make so much stuff in the broader market. I'm pretty sure that the camera in my iPhone is a Sony camera. So like, I'm not saying that like I'm total absolute, but when it comes to buying something that's Sony as a brand, I'm not a big fan of the company. I'm not a big fan of the brand. But I'm talking about their stuff anyway because, well, they're a competitor out there, and they're a competitor to Canon, and what they're doing and what their products are and what the deal is maybe not, I mean, I'm not necessarily going to switch from Canon to Sony. I've looked at switching brands, as a total aside, I've looked at switching brands in the past. I was looking to switch from Canon to Nikon when the D700 was state-of-the-art Nikon body, and I was shooting a Canon, I think I was shooting a 1D Mark III at the time, and the D700 looked really compelling, and I had a friend with one, and I played with his a little, and I was really thinking about switching from Canon to Nikon, and the costs just were so overwhelmingly stacked against switching. Now, I know going from Canon to Sony, especially because almost all of my lenses are still, well, all of my lenses currently are still EF lenses. I could take my EF lenses, put mount adapters, and shoot them on Sony. And I'd really only be eating the loss on the bodies and eventually the lenses, because the reality is I wouldn't probably want to shoot EF on Sony forever if I was to say to do that. But the short of the long part there is that my experience is changing brands is, you never come out ahead. And I really have to find that when I'm thinking, talking, looking, whatever you want to say about, say, changing a brand or changing brands, you really have to wait what you're getting in this change in a completely, like, absolute possible going forward in time sense versus what you're getting or what you're paying in the short run. So, you know, does Sony have a track record, for example, of having interesting lenses that you would want to have that you can't have, or that Canon or Nikon or whatever your current brand is isn't interested in producing? So, and then of course the thing that I come back to, and I tell this to everybody who asks me about buying a camera in the first place, is ergonomics. At this point, at this point, the technical differences between Sony, Canon, and Nikon are so minuscule as a selling point that the major consideration is really ergonomics and your ability to work around the camera. And that was the other reason I didn't switch to Nikon years ago, is even though they had interesting cameras and they were, kicking Canon's ass in some respects, in, for example, dynamic range, and even like, the D850 out dynamic ranged and out resolutioned the, or very nearly out dynamic ranged, the 5D Mark IV, and I think it out frame rated it too. But ergonomics, and ignoring the cost thing, the ergonomics for me on Nikon are so bad. And I'm not saying that this should be anybody else's situation. There's people who Nikon's UI and ergonomics that just click, and they are happy as, a clam essentially with Nikon's ergonomics. This is one of those things where it's entirely personal, and I always get frustrated when I run into people who are like, well, you should switch because this, and it's like, yeah, but then I'm going to just be frustrated all the time that I'm using the camera, to the point that maybe I won't want to actually take pictures because it's just that frustrating to me. And I don't find it to be something that's very, what do I want to say? Yeah, you can, if you do it long enough, you can get over the frustration. But if I'm being frustrated for months or a year or weeks, even for a 1% improvement in something, or a 0% improvement in something, because, well, sure, the camera's got, say, more dynamic range, but I can't actually use it because I'm not capable of exploiting that, or it's at ISO 50 and I can't shoot at ISO 50 because everything I do has to have a higher shutter speed and a slower aperture, and ISO 50 would just ruin all the pictures. So, in weighting things, like if you're already a professional shooting Sony, obviously this is going to be a big upgrade for you. It kicks the butt of the Alpha 9. It looks really, I won't say interesting, but well, I guess that's the other thing, is I have gotten bitter with, well, not bitter. I'm just not jazzed about cameras anymore. Like, I don't see stuff coming from camera companies that's like, wow, I gotta have this. I mean, yeah, I pre-ordered an R5 because it was a really good upgrade from what I had, and I figured I needed to move to mirrorless, or I wanted to move to mirrorless, or I wanted to at least have a good mirrorless. I was really looking at an EOS R, but it just wasn't an upgrade from my 5D Mark IVs. So the R5 was an upgrade in that respect. So I pre-ordered that, but then I spent pretty much all the time between when I pre-ordered it and 3 weeks after I had the camera and was shooting with it, really wondering if I made the right decision, because it's just another camera. It's like the quality, the image quality, the improvements, the capabilities, that's just a camera. It's just more of the same to me. So anyway, let's talk about the Alpha 1. So it is definitely a pro targeted camera. It's $6,500. It's got pro level features in terms of frame rate and so forth. But at the same time, when you look at what Sony put out on the, put out for the product, it's not really a pro sized camera. It's a R5, it's an A7, it's not integrated battery grip. It doesn't use larger, higher capacity batteries. Well, I mean, they may be higher capacity, but they're not like Canon and Nikon Pro cameras have substantially different form factor batteries that are much higher voltage and higher capacity than the R5s. And obviously, presumably, I mean, I just have to assume Sony did the market research on this. but maybe they didn't. It's hard for me to tell because Nikon's talking about, and what little has been said about the Z9, that it's going to be a D6 style camera, so full pro size body. And the assumption is generally been that the EOS R1, or whatever Canon chooses to call it, but we suspect it will be the R1, we being anybody who's paying much attention to it, the EOS R1 is expected to be the same kind of thing, integrated vertical shooting grip, larger pro style body. And looking at what Sony put out, it's just another Alpha A7 size camera. It's small. It's not appreciably wider. It's I think a little bit deeper, which could just be the viewfinder sticking off the back further. It's, as far as I can tell in comparing pictures, there isn't appreciably more clearance between the hand grip and the lens mount, which means that some of the really fast really fast for Sony lenses, like the 85-1.4, I think is one example, are going to be extremely cramped on the camera. And I mean, it'll work, obviously, but I feel like, I don't know, like maybe I don't have the heartbeat of the camera industry in my, realm or wheelhouse or whatever. But a perfect example, I put battery grips on all my cameras because they improve the ergonomics, they improve the usability, and they improve what I have to hold, and they also double my battery capacity, which is no small thing to sneeze at. And I had a 1D, so I had a 1D at one point. If I could get Canon to release a single unified body like the 1D, but as an R5, like if the R5 didn't have a separate battery grip, it was a one-part camera, I would have been all over that. Like, that would be phenomenal, because the thing that I find comes with integrated battery or integrated vertical grips is, first of all, the camera can be smaller because you don't have to have the clear delineation between a battery grip and the camera itself. So the controls and things can be placed on the camera body in a more compact fashion. Second of all, you don't need to have the locking mechanism or any of the sort of interspersion between the battery grip and the camera. So almost all cameras with battery grips, there's a screw, a 1/4-20 screw that locks it in, and that's a 1/4 of an inch of height of the combined camera that has to be there to tie the battery grip to the camera, but doesn't necessarily have to be in the camera if it was a unified thing. Additionally, you give up internal volume of the camera. So a Canon camera like the R5, for example, or any Canon camera, the battery connects to the battery grip batteries connect to the camera with a dummy battery that plugs into the battery space in the hand grip of the camera. So you have a volume in the camera where the battery would have been that you can't use because there has to be a battery there when the battery grip is not attached. And if you don't do that, if you don't have this separate battery grip with the battery plugging into the camera, and bear in mind, even if you talk about, say, a Nikon camera where the battery grip doesn't use a dummy battery to plug into the camera, you either have a regular Nikon, small, I can't remember what the battery is for, like say the R6 or the D850, but the smaller LPE6 sized, for lack of a better word, battery. Even if you have or don't have a fake battery or a dummy battery that fits in from the battery grip, you can't get rid of that void in the camera. You either have to have some of the old Nikon cameras, and I'm not sure if this has changed, but I know this was the case in the past, you had to have the standard battery. Like, at least this was the case with the D700, is the last time I talked to somebody who had, or who, you know, about this. But you had to have the standard battery in the camera, and then you could have a second battery in the grip. But even if you're not talking about that, even if you're just talking about, like, you can power the camera from batteries in the grip, and you don't need to have anything plugged in, you know, physically connected through the camera into the battery well that would normally be in the camera, you still have to have the battery well there, because not everybody's going to have a battery grip. And so for all the people who don't use battery grips, they have to have a battery in the camera where the battery would be. Now, if you go to an integral body, a one-piece body, all of that volume can be used for something else, like cooling or a heat sink or circuitry. You could move more of the electronics away from, say, the sensor, and put them in that space to, you know, aid ensuring that the sensor is cooler. Now, with the Alpha 1, Sony doesn't really have that problem. They've got a cooling system, and they look like, from the drawings that they've shown on their site, or the diagrams, or whatever you want to call it, they have, they're dissipating heat around the lens mount somewhere. But when you start talking about integral grip cameras, you just have, there's more room to work. In the EOS 1s from Canon, they instead of having so on an R5, the cards go in this way. I've got the camera rotated, but you open the door and the cards go in directly from, you know, perpendicular to the lens axis. In the EOS 1s, the cards go in parallel to the lens axis, so from the back towards the front. And they can do that because the hand grip doesn't have a battery in it. And that means they can lay out the components inside the camera differently. They can better organize things for heat dissipation, and so on and so forth. And when you're talking about, you know, a pro camera, that's something you really have to consider. It's, you know, one of the things that's arguably the biggest disappointment with the R5 and R6 are the thermal limits when recording video, because there's a lot of equipment crammed into a tiny package, and just cooling that is difficult. Okay, all that said, here's the other problem that I run into with not having an integral vertical grip and using a two-part system. Rigidity. The rigidity of the camera when you're mounting it to a tripod, or when you're, say, using an L plate and mounting it, you know, either to the vertical or the horizontal part of the L plate. But when you're mounting the camera to a tripod, a one-piece body like a D6 or a 1DX camera is way more rigid. Now, when we were talking about 18 megapixel sensors, 20 megapixel sensors, 16 megapixel sensors, you know, didn't really make that much of a difference. You really didn't have to worry so much about the flex in the camera causing that much of a problem. I had a, you know, it wasn't that big of a deal. Now when we're talking 45, 50, 60 megapixel sensors in these cameras, okay, A7R is 60, it's not the, and presumably, you know, there's talk, Canon rumors is talking at like an 80 megapixel EOS R high resolution body is supposed to be coming soon. When you start talking about these really high resolutions that are the new normal, actually, but when you start talking about these resolutions, they really start placing a lot more demand on, well, your lenses, your technique, And just the rigidity of all of your equipment, the rigidity of the lens mount, the rigidity of the flex becomes an issue, and the sensors are so much more sensitive to that. And so, I could be completely wrong in thinking this, except I'm not sure that I am, because I just watched a thing on ESPN where they were talking to the what was it, the head photographer and director of photography for the NFL, and they were showing some behind the scenes shots of photographers shooting NFL games, and the people that were shooting Sony had battery grips on their Sony cameras. And I didn't see a single person shooting Sony that didn't have a battery grip on their camera in that context, shooting sports in the NFL. Now, that may not be indicative of all cases. And that may be Sony's thought process is, well, it's a 50 megapixel camera, so it'll be used by people other than photojournalists or sports and action photographers. Of course, it's a 50 megapixel $6,500 camera, and they have a 60 megapixel $2,800, $3,000 camera, whatever it is, the A7R4. I'm not sure, again, I don't get gear from anybody, and I don't have a company like a newspaper or something like that sending me buying, or buying my gear for me. And so I tend to look at bang for the buck, and as a landscape and wildlife photographer, I'd rather buy a $3,800 or $3,000 or whatever camera, or buy two of those instead of buying one $6,500 camera, even if those cheaper cameras were only 90% as capable. I shot wildlife for years with 6.5 frame per second cameras. What I learned from that experience was essentially, yeah, having more frames per second is helpful. It works, it does things, but it's not so over the top critical that 10 frames or 12 frames per second versus 30 frames per second. Well, 30 frames per second I'd almost probably never be shooting in, because it just generates so much data that it becomes a real hassle to try and edit. So anyway, let's see, what else? Battery life. And this isn't a shot at Sony. This is the issue with mirrorless cameras, period, end of story, across the range, finished. Battery life sucks. Nobody has a mirrorless camera with good battery life. I don't think anybody is going to have a mirrorless camera with good battery life. I think the only thing that's going to happen is we're either going to have way bigger batteries due to some improvement in battery tech, or people are going to just get used to it. And I think the latter is probably what's actually going to happen. People are just going to get used to it. So Sony is claiming the A1 will get 430 frames per charge using the viewfinder and 530 frames per charge using the LCD. So you assume, I would assume, I can't be 100% certain, but I would assume you could double that if you're using the battery grip with two batteries in it. So you're looking at like 1,000 to 1,000, just over 1,000 frames per charge as a sort of standard. Okay, my 1D Mark III only was 10 megapixels and only shoot 10 frames a second, but I shot an air show with that where I was hammering it continuously, or pretty much continuously for the whole show, and I shot 28,000 or 2,800 or 3,000 frames with only using about 55% of the battery. I had 45% of the charge left at the end of the day. When you start talking about mirrorless, you're really talking about burning battery. I'm seeing this even with my R5. I'm not shooting tons and tons and tons with it, and it does really darn good. Like, I'm really impressed. I shot almost 1,000 frames of an air show with the R5, and I had plenty of battery going in, plenty of battery coming out, and that was at 20 frames a second. So, like, it's not world ending. Like, I would certainly not ever say don't get a mirrorless camera because the battery is so bad that you just can't ever use it and it's garbage. But if you're coming from, again, like I said, a professional DSLR where you're used to being able to get 1,000 frames, or not 1,000 frames, 2,000 or more frames a day on a battery, no problem, then, you're not going to be getting that. And like I said, like even my 5D Mark IV, when I was traveling and carrying a 5D Mark IV, I would get 2 or 3 days of shooting on a pair of batteries in the grip. And that would translate to well in excess of 1,000 frames shot. And I don't ever expect to see that with my R5. And I'm really, given the state of battery technology and processor technology and just the general power costs of doing certain things, I don't really see that situation changing in the mirrorless market as it stands. And so, speaking of batteries, for example, one of the biggest killers, and this is interesting. This is why whenever you look at camera specs and they give you always you will. I have not yet seen a camera that doesn't have specs that follow this mirrorless. You will always see fewer frames using the viewfinder than using the LCD, the rear screen. And the biggest reason for that comes down to processing load. So the rear screen on most cameras, and I don't have a note here, is with respect to the A1, but the rear screen is mostly somewhat slightly higher than VGA. It's certainly less than a megapixel, or well, it's around a megapixel, give or take. Viewfinders are, for example, the viewfinder in the A1 is advertised as being a 9.44 million dot display. I don't know what it is. Here's another thing. Camera companies, can we please stop acting like the subpixels in your viewfinders are relevant? They're not. Every time they say, oh, it's a 9.44 million dot display, just divide it by 3 because nobody cares that, I mean, they're counting the red, the green, and the blue subpixels, and like, you have to have all 3 to have a pixel that produces an image that we can see. Stop inflating the numbers. Just tell us what the resolution is at the relevant, granularity for us. So it's a 9.44 million dot, 3.14 megapixel viewfinder. The actual resolution is 2048 by 1563, which, hey, that's not bad for, a viewfinder. And it's at 240 frames per second, or capable of running at 240 frames per second, which is twice that of the R5. The R5's running at 120 frames per second is pretty darn good in my experience. It's pretty smooth. I mean, unless you're in a really dark environment. If you're in a dark environment, you get, it just, none of these cameras, inherent limitation of mirrorless. So in a DSLR, the viewfinder just uses the light in the environment, and the worst case scenario in a dark environment, well, the worst case scenario in a dark environment is the environment's too dark for you to be able to look through the viewfinder and see anything. Now, this is one place where I would argue, again, it's all compromises. Engineering is all compromises. Mirrorlesses have a leg up. I can take my R5 and go into almost a completely black room, minimum light, and especially if I have a fast lens, a 1.8 or a 2 or a 1.4 or a 1.2 or something like that on it, it'll ramp up the gain on the sensor and I can see. Like, it's like night vision in some ways, which is kind of cool when you think about, like, I mean, it's not as good as actual proper night vision, obviously, but it's pretty darn impressive if you're used to the situation with a DSLR where the viewfinder is just dark and you can't see anything. The con of that is to give you that kind of thing, the viewfinder gets real choppy because the frame rates have to drop. The camera is doing longer integration. Essentially, it's a longer shutter speed, and so it can't pump 120 or 240 or even 60 or 30 frames a second of information through to the viewfinder. But anyway, going back to the viewfinder, the reason that every mirrorless camera gets fewer shots using the viewfinder than the rear display comes down to the amount of data that has to be dealt with. So you have 2 or 3 or 4 times as much information generally going to the viewfinder. So if you have a standard-ish rear LCD and it's sub 1 megapixel, or like usually about well, they're usually a lot lower than that. They're usually, I think, around 400 kilopixels or 300 kilopixels or something like that, because they're like 900,000 dots. Again, the dots. But anyway, compared to, say, almost a 10 million dot viewfinder. Now, the camera isn't processing in dots. The camera is processing in pixels. But anyway, you're talking about, just think about it. You have, and I'm going to use dots, even though I don't want to. You have a 800,000 dot LCD. You have a 9.44 million dot viewfinder. You have to process more information. More information has to be read from the sensor. More information has to be crunched. Now, combine that with the fact that the rear LCDs almost never have high frame rates. They're usually 60 frames per second, if that, and they probably are running lower than that. I've never seen anybody, actually, any manufacturer, advertise what the rear LCDs are running at, but a good bet, based on just LCD technology in general, is they're probably not running faster than 60 frames per second. I would be very surprised, but I don't know of anybody who's actually tested that. So you have low resolution at relatively low frame rate. Compare that to high resolution at relatively high frame rates, and the simple just reality is you're always going to burn more power with the LCD or the viewfinder than you do with the LCD. And that's why, like, a friend of mine who goes to Africa, and he's looking at his next trip to Africa whenever we can travel again, and he's going to have a Nikon Z6, Z6 Mark II, and like, I'm telling him, well, when you're sitting there watching the leopard in the tree, you probably want to, and it's not doing anything, you probably want to use the LCD if you can instead of the viewfinder, because it'll save you power, it'll give you more shots. It'll give you a longer time to be watching it through the lens, etc., etc. So more higher resolution, higher frame rate viewfinders certainly make the viewfinder in the EVF more like an optical viewfinder. They also cost more power, and power is really, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest drawback. Power consumption is the biggest drawback to mirrorless cameras as a whole. Okay, so going back to power, because there was one other thing. 90 minutes of video recording with the viewfinder, 95 minutes with the LCD, to go with the 430 frames viewfinder and 530 frames LCD on a battery. It is what it is. So let's talk about the sensor for a little bit. 50 megapixels, up to 30 frames a second. Now, with most things Sony, there's a caveat to that. So if you're shooting lossless or uncompressed RAW, then your frame rate's limited to 20 frames a second. I don't know how big of an issue that's going to be. I don't know how many people shoot lossless RAW with 45, 50 plus megapixel cameras. The R5, I have a choice between Canon's lossless compressed RAW, which Canon, I like that Canon did this from the start, but basically they losslessly compressed their RAW files and that was it. Like, they didn't do this, oh, you can have a completely uncompressed RAW file, like just more space for no gain. Like, that just, never made any sense why Nikon had an uncompressed RAW format. So they have, on the R5, I have lossless compressed RAW and lossy compressed RAW. So that's CR2 and CR3. And I think they still use CR2 for the lossless files. And I just switched to CR3. I shoot everything lossy. The loss isn't so relevant that it really matters. And the gain in space, like you have two factors working. The loss in quality is not really appreciable. It can, in some potential circumstances and at high ISOs, be a potential issue, at least the way Canon's doing it. So Nikon's lossy RAW, which really isn't lossy in a compression sense, it's lossy and it throws away noise and makes things more efficient, which is really what everybody should be doing. But anyway, so it can be not as good at high ISOs, and it's, there goes the train of thought. Not as good at high ISOs as lossless RAW, and it basically, yeah, there we go. Basically, the counter to that is there's so much resolution in these cameras to work with that losing a little resolution or noise issue, due to noise or due to the compression, isn't really that big of a deal. It doesn't matter. That's one of the things that I've come to realize with a lot of these, really, I came to realize this with the 30 megapixels in my R5 or my 5D Mark IV. I certainly see it with the 45 and the R5, and anything that resolution or higher. The reality is that we have so much resolution in our cameras at this point that for the vast majority of what you're doing with the images, you're not really going to leverage all of that resolution. Yeah, sure, if you're printing a really big print, bigger than 2 foot, like 5 foot or 2 meters across or 3 meters across or something, or 10 feet across or whatever, sure, that resolution is probably going to help. But if you're printing A3 plus, so 13 by 19s, or even 16 by 20s, or God forbid, the only thing you're doing with your images is putting them up on the web, or even putting them in magazines. An 8 by 10 at 300 ppi is 8 megapixels. You don't need a 50 megapixel camera to do that, which is actually, I think, one of the sort of arguments that I keep seeing come up against what the rumored specs of the Z6 or the Z9 Nikon's unannounced, yet unannounced, I think, flagship mirrorless, and this, the A1. 45, 50 megapixels isn't really beneficial when the target market or the target medium is magazines or newspapers. Especially, like, newspapers are incredibly low resolution. And I keep seeing it come up that that's not 50 megapixels, 45 megapixels. That's not what these kind of pro shooters want. They want smaller resolution files. They want, now some of the arguments about dynamic range are a little like, noise is definitely something that becomes a better appearing thing the finer the pixel pitch is, and the finer the noise structure becomes. But like, the argument I keep seeing is that pros want smaller images in the 18 to 20 megapixel range, and even smaller than that, because they're faster to work with, they're smaller, they're easier, and there isn't a benefit to having this huge 45, 50 megapixel image for them. Now, I can't speak for myself. I moved away from Canon's 1 series of cameras because when they went to the 1DX, it was an 18 megapixel camera, and 18 megapixels wasn't, I wanted more resolution. Of course, I shoot landscapes. I make big prints. I make panos that are 30 by 90 inches, you know, kind of thing. And so having more resolution to work with in the individual frame, for me, is worth, to a point, to an extent. Everything has a diminishing return, but it's worth it to an extent for having the ability to make those big prints. But I'm also, like I said, not a photojournalist. I'm not a sports photographer. I'm not trying to, I don't work in an industry where it's publish or perish, and you have to publish, you know, publish first or perish. So there isn't this inherent rush from me to get images uploaded and edited and published as quick as possible. Now, again, sort of the ideal solution in most or some respects is you have a 45 or 50 megapixel sensor and you have a 25 megapixel mode that saves a 25 megapixel file, and it happens to be a better 25 megapixel file than if you just had a 25 megapixel sensor. And I'm sure you could probably do that on the Alpha 1, and I'm sure that that would be the most, to me, that would be the most sensible thing. Of course, I've talked to professional photographers who didn't want 45 megapixel cameras, and they were looking at like the D850, and I said, well, just put it into 24 megapixel mode and just shoot the thing as a 24 megapixel camera, let the camera downsize or downsample everything, and you'll probably get better 24 megapixel images out of that than if you were shooting with a native 24 megapixel camera. And the push I always got from that was, I paid for 45 megapixels. I damn well better use or better have 45 megapixels. So I don't know. It's one of those weird things. So frame rate, resolution, again, 30 frames a second. So frame rate. Frame rate is one of those things where past a point, it just becomes a speck on the box that I don't see an actual, like, real value to. It's just a number. In my experience, 20 frames a second on my R5 versus, say, 12 frames a second, the 20 frames a second, the only thing it does for me is give me more files to edit. I don't find that I get better results or the peak action moment more effectively or something like that. I find it's 58 files that I delete instead of 35 files that I delete. And that means I got to have space on the card. I have to have space on my hard drive. I have to have things, you know, everything to sort of manage it. So I could see the value of it. And I have friends who are photojournalists that are doing sports stuff, and they would love to have 20 or 30 frames a second, or at least that's what they say, shooting at 8 to 10 or 12. But like I said, I'm not sure how that, like, I would not be surprised to see them change their tune after they have to start dealing with, well, you need a terabyte of storage now instead of 128 gigs to get through a quarter or a half of a football game or something like that. So, yeah, I don't know. And there's also a part of me that kind of goes, why not just, like, I think the real problem that I end up having with high frame rates is the tools I just don't find are in place to deal with them. So Lightroom is not especially good at helping you edit 700 very similar looking images. It certainly could be. There certainly could be a push to get software like Lightroom or Photo Mechanic or, you know, any of these kinds of editing packages that are digital asset managers and whatnot to start being able to do things like rate composition or rate focus or highlight things based on rules of thumb or whatever you want to call it, to sort of make it where when you're looking at 500 pictures that all look almost the same, how do you decide? Like how do you narrow that down quickly? I ran into this problem a number of years ago when I first shot an eagle, and I was super excited because it was my first bald eagle, first real trip out to do bird photography like that. And I ended up shooting, now the numbers sound laughable to me when I talk about it now, but I ended up shooting somewhere around 600 images of this bird. I had 200 of it looking this way, 200 of it looking this way, and 200 of it looking at the camera. And I got to editing them. And the end result in editing them was I had so much overload from trying to find which pose or which image was sharpest or which pose was the best, or, you know, it was just, you look at 200 almost identical pictures and it really starts to be like the cognitive load of trying to narrow that down really gets challenging, for lack of a better word. And, you know, now that we have cameras, the R5, R6 shoot 20 frames a second. The Alpha 1 shoots 30 frames a second. The Z9 and R1 are probably going to be at least 20 to 30 frames a second. Of course, the 1DX2 and 3, or the 1DX3 will do 20 frames a second in live view, and I think the 1DX2 will do 16 frames a second in live view. So, you know, you're talking cameras that are producing a ton of images, and the camera, I mean, I think I said this in a previous video, the camera companies have innovated. They've innovated, well, or iterated. They've iterated right into a situation where the software companies that make the stuff that we use to edit the pictures haven't caught up and haven't given us better tools to be able to deal with that. So, you know, but from a selling perspective, 20 frames per second, 30 frames per second, just shoot video. I don't know. It's cool, I guess, that Sony actually has up to 30 frames a second, but then on the same token, given that like, for example, given that the R5 can shoot video at 8K video at 30 frames a second, I would not be surprised if the hardware wasn't capable of shooting 45 megapixel stills at 30 frames a second. It's just well, we're not going to give you that because nobody seems to need it or care, you know, or whatever. I mean, at least that's my supposition. Maybe I'm wrong, but like, there's a lot more data being processed going from 20 to 30 frames a second than there is going from 32 to 45 megapixels or something like that, you know, at those resolutions. So video stuff. I think it's pretty cool that the Alpha 1 has 24-bit audio at 48 kilohertz. That's about all the pretty cool is. It's recording in AVC and HEVC, so H.264 and H.265. I think 10 or 12-bit maximum, but I don't know, I'm torn on this. Because, like, there's a part of me that gets really frustrated with, like, the pro video industry. So, dear Canon, I would pay you to be able to upgrade my EOS R or my 5D Mark IV or both of them to record an unlimited clip instead of 30 minutes. Yes, I know. The people in the European Union would have to pay a higher tax or whatever it is. I don't care. Now, I know there's a lot of people that would say, well, that's just because they're protecting their cinema cameras, but the cheapest cinema cameras are way more expensive than my DSLR and way bigger than my DSLR or mirrorless. And they're not still cameras. So I get the argument, but then on the same token, like, I would be willing to pay for an upgrade to that. The way I've been looking at working around that has been to look at external recorders, so the Atomos Ninjas and stuff like that. The problem is, for me at least, all the external recorders want to treat, well, you're buying an external recorder, you must want a super big file. So it's ProRes or DNxHR, and the bit rates go through the roof. And, and this is nothing to slight either of those in a, professional workflow. And it's nothing to slight the codecs. I render out everything that I do in DaVinci Resolve on my regular videos in DNxHR and then convert it to H.264 to upload to YouTube. I could just upload the DNxHR, but I don't really feel that it's necessary to upload 60 and 80 gig files just for the sake of uploading a 60 or 80 gig file. So, like, I like AVC or HEVC and HEVC, and I like them because they make small files. And the cost of storage is something that I think many people underestimate. I always underestimated. I was always the thing like, storage is cheap, just buy more storage, and that's great until you have several terabytes, like 16, 20, 30 terabytes, and how do you back it up? How do you ensure redundancy? Like, I really do not like the idea of, well, I'm going to just buy Western Digital MyBook hard drives or whatever, and, when it fills up, I'll buy another one. Like, to me, that's a great way to end up losing a lot of your data, because the hard drive fails, or data corruption, or bit rot, or, if there's a fire and you're running out, and instead of being able to just like have an online backup or grab one hard drive that's a backup or one tape that's a backup, you have all of these hard drives, or having your backups kept off site, you have all of these hard drives with your data on it and really no backup. So like I said, I like smaller formats. On the other hand, I certainly can understand the slew of people who want RAW or ProRes RAW, or even just full ProRes or full DNxHR, because they're using the cameras in a higher tier environment than I am. So, like, I can appreciate that. So, like, from my perspective, I think it's great that the camera does AVC and HEVC, but I can also see that, because I didn't see anything about Cinema Raw or some kind of raw video or ProRes or, that kind of thing. I could also see where the serious cinematography side of things ends up kind of looking at it and going, we don't like that. So I don't know. Again, it's one of those things. I know what I'd would like to have seen, and maybe I want to say I think I maybe saw something about having high bit rate or high bit depth uncompressed HDMI out that you could run to a recorder, so I guess maybe that would work. But then cables, connections, that gets flaky. You run into potential problems with that. There's a certain extent where I do kind of like the fact that, like, the R5, if I really need raw video, it's done to the card in the camera, and I don't have to worry about, well, did the HDMI cable come loose or something like that. So, obviously it's going to be Sony's got a handle on video to a large extent. So, obviously that's going to be pretty good one way or another. Media. This was, I think, one of the coolest things that I saw in the A1 to an extent. The dual card slots can you can either use an SD card or a CFExpress type A card. And the slots are designed so that both cards fit. And I thought, man, that's a neat idea. Because the problem I keep running into with cameras with dual card slots, at least as a Canon user, is unless you're buying an EOS 1 or a 1DX, I think the 1DXs as a whole, but at least the 2 and the 3, your card slots are two different kinds. So the 5D Mark IV is compact flash and SD. The R5 is CFExpress and SD. And I run into this situation where, first of all, I hate having different kind of cards. If I can avoid it, I would really just prefer to have everything be the same card. I don't like, well, I have to have an SD Express and a CF Express and an SD card to have, you know, like redundancy. I don't use redundancy a lot in my shooting anyway, but if I have it or I want it, I don't like the need to have two different cards. I've argued for a long time that what I would really love to see the camera manufacturers do, and it's especially doable now because you have SD Express and CF Express, and they both use a PCI Express as the underlying electrical communication, which means the controller, the processors on the camera are talking to something through PCI Express because it makes so little sense to have it, the CPU talk to another chip, then that converts something to PCI Express to feed to the card. You know, it makes more sense that it, especially since all these companies, Canon, Nikon, Sony, etc., are all designing essentially custom SoCs as their processors in the camera. They're not buying a off-the-shelf part that you just put PCI Express stuff in the SoC and you plug it into the cards. And so it would be really feasible to have user interchangeable card slots at this point, so that, like, if I want two SD slots, I could put two SD slots in the camera. And so maybe, you know, with two SD slots in an R5, I can't shoot 8K RAW or 4K 120. Maybe I don't care. Maybe the fact that I have two relatively inexpensive 256 gig cards that I can use for redundancy and shooting stills at a reasonable, you know, buffer clearing speed, so on and so forth, that's all I care about. And I don't really care about 8K raw video or 120, 4K 120 or something like that. Like I said, I do a lot of still work. Still photography is still my primary interest, even though I make more videos probably than I shoot pictures at this point. But for me, shooting pictures, I find more often than not, it's like, I don't need a stupid fast CFExpress card. It's just a lot of money for those little edge, the two edge cases, 8K RAW and 4K 120 video. Otherwise, I'm good with SD cards, even UHS-1 cards. Like the air show that I just shot with the R5 last summer, or last fall, I guess, I shot it all on an SD card. I didn't need a CFExpress card to cover that. And so if you're not going to do like where I can just remove the card slots and put in the card slots I want, I really like what Sony did here with the two card slots. So you can put two cards in the camera, but they can either be both SD, both CFExpress, or one of each. And I think that's a really slick solution. Now, I don't like CFExpress Type A. I understand why Sony's using it. It's smaller than Type B, and their cameras tend to continue to be small. And so I can understand not wanting to dedicate the internal space to the Type A cards. I think Type A, you know, like, I'm not going to say it's horrible or something like that, but I think it's going to generally tend to be more expensive than Type B because it's smaller than Type B. And so you have to have, like, in a Type B card, you have more room for the controller, more room for the NAND flash, and so on and so forth. So you, like, it just, you could use larger dies, essentially, which are cheaper. I find in general that CFExpress Type B is, I've always felt SD was a little small. Not unusably small, but I've always been really concerned about dropping an SD card in the grass and never being able to find it. Never really felt that with compact flash. The cards were just big enough that I felt like I had a much better grip on it. And with CFExpress cards, the Type B cards sort of fall into the line of, they're probably about the size that I feel I'm comfortable with handling. They could be a little bigger, but much smaller than that. And I start again going back to the getting worried about dropping a card in the grass somewhere or in rocks somewhere and not being able to find it because I had to change cards. So dual slots, those are cool. So the last note I have in a talking point about the A1 is, well, no stupid Nikon-esque ISOs. So the ISO range natively is 100 to 32,000, and it expands to 50 to 50 to 102,400. And I was really worried when Nikon came out with the D5 and had ISO 3.2 million. And the worry that I had was, oh God, now all the camera companies are going to follow and they're going to do these stupid high ISOs that are basically unusable. And the reality is 3.2 million on a D5 or a D6 doesn't give you a good picture. It doesn't give you a usable picture. In fact, looking at the dynamic range, I think Nikon's thought process with that was, we have a big number to put on the box and nobody has a number this big. So nobody's going to be able to compete with us. Like, people are going to see it and they're going to be like, yeah, I got to have this camera, the Nikon, because of the big ISO. And I'm really happy to see that by and large, the entire rest of the camera industry has thought that was as dumb of an idea as I have or did, and they've all stuck to reasonable ISO ranges. And the truth is quite honestly, I've never, in any situation that I have shot in that I can ever think of, and I mean, obviously I can't speak for everyone, but I have never shot in a situation where I've gone, man, I wish I could shoot this at ISO 800,000. Like, when I get to 102,000, for whatever reason, I'm basically at the point where I need the picture more than I need a good picture. And it still needs to be good enough that you can tell what you're looking at. And that's like, even getting to that situation, I find it incredibly rare and incredibly difficult to run into. Now, slow lenses, I can see the argument, but like, what I found far more useful in my 5D Mark IVs or my R5s is having enough resolution and enough image quality to make ISO 32,000 to 12,800 usable. That's a range where I find that I run into things in, either because, hey, I'm shooting at f8, an f5.6 lens with a teleconverter, so it's f8, or I'm shooting in less than ideal light, so under a forest canopy with an f5.6 lens at f8. I mean, one of the things that I've kind of run into, and it's completely tangential to super high ISOs, but is I've run into situations where you can't just shoot with fast lens because there isn't enough depth of field to get everything you want in focus. And so you end up having to shoot stopped down one way or another. And you still need the shutter speed. And by and large, if you're shooting in the day, that ends up, in my experience, even in overcast conditions in a rainforest under the canopy, and I'm still not going above 10 or 12,000. And I think that's really kind of, and I'm getting usable pictures. I can print these pictures and have a usable print, at least say to 16 by 20, at least an A3 plus. So I'm not convinced, and I never have been, that you really needed 1.6 or 3.2 million or even 800,000 as a top end ISO on the camera. And I find it really frustrating when I see companies like, in the case of Nikon, who got there by compromising dynamic range and compromising on the signal, the quality of the image, so that you couldn't rely on getting a good image at the highest ISO settings. I always found that frustrating. And when I see Sony, who arguably has some of the some of the better sensor tech on the market. They can build a sensor. I mean, I may argue that, and I would argue that Canon, Nikon, Sony at this point, the sensor tech differences aren't really material. But Sony can definitely build a camera sensor that works. It produces good images, produces good dynamic range, has noise under control. Given that, and that this is a professional tiered camera, flagship camera, supposedly going to be competitive in the, with the likes of the Canon R1 or the Nikon Z9 or what have you, and this is going to be the pro shooter's camera. And looking at the specs, looking at the price tag, that's what this is. They didn't go hog wild, nutso crazy on the ISO range. In fact, I think it's kind of interesting in some respects that my R5, the base ISO range is wider than the A50 or the A1s. The R5 goes from 100 to 52,000 or 52,100 or whatever it is. Yeah. 51,200, 50,000, whatever it is. Before you get to the expanded, and this only goes up to 32,000. It basically is the same ISO range as the EOS R and the 5D Mark IV. And I applaud Sony. I have to say, I applaud Sony for not trying to just stamp numbers on the box, because I know that they could have easily made the sensor go to 800,000 or 1.6 million or something like that. They could have easily just thrown the bottom away, let the bottom fall out, and had the camera go nutso high, ISOs. And they didn't take Nikon's bait, and they're actually going to produce something that it's reasonable. It covers needs. It doesn't go gonzo crazy. So, wrapping this up, because I have actually gone on almost an hour and a half, way longer than I had actually intended to do this video, all things considered. I posed myself the question, as an EOS R5 owner, does any of the stuff that Sony's put out in the A1 get me excited or interested in switching platforms or anything of that? And I put this question to myself, and I came to the answer, which is no. And I think this is increasingly coming to be sort of the position. I mean, I could argue that there was room to make a move when Canon didn't have the R5 and Nikon was struggling with the first generation Z6 and 7, and Sony had a platform and they had tech and they had quality, and yeah, if you needed to move, that was, you could certainly make an argument to make a move there. At this point, I'm increasingly coming to the opinion that
it's really hard to to justify making a move in platforms based on a camera. I can see justifying making a move in platforms based on lenses. Uh, especially now where you can't um, like you can't mount you can't put an RF lens on a Z or an alpha or something like that. There's just not enough room in the mount to make it where you can adapt them. And we're seeing things happening on Canon and Nikon's mirrorless platforms that Sony isn't competing with. I won't say that they're not in a position to compete with, but they might not be in a position to compete with. I know they did a study a while back where they talked about how fast a theoretical aperture lens that each of the platforms could mount, and they could mount theoretically, I think it was a 0.85 or something like that lens. There's a big difference between theory and actual product that can be put out on the market. And when you look at what Canon is putting out, the RF primes are all f1.2, the L ones, the good stuff, the good stuff. Sony's sitting at Canon's doing f1.2s, Sony's sitting at f1.4, and Nikon is like, I don't even know what they're doing, right? They put out the 58 f.95, and I look at the lens and it's like $8,000, and I go, I can't believe they're selling that many of those. It's a super niche, super specialized type, piece of hardware. Versus, say, for example, Canon's 28 to 70 f2, which I'll have one of these days. I have ordered one, and when they come into stock, hopefully I will get one, and I will be talking about the 28 to 70 f2, which I consider to be the most insane lens I have ever bought or used. And I can say this having used a 600 f4, and it's more expensive, sure, but I don't think it's anywhere near as crazy of a lens as the 28 to 70 f2 is. That's like the right combination of really fast and general purpose zoom and portrait range, and it's just, I think it's a bonkers lens, and I don't see that in the Alpha platform. Now, I'm certainly not saying that somebody should switch to Canon, or, I'm certainly not saying switch to Canon and get a 70 or 28 to 70 f2. It's the, bee's knees or whatever. But the thing is, right now with the camera tech, everybody's got stuff that's good. The R5 is good. The Z7 Mark II is good. The A7R Mark IV and the A1 are good. The A9 is good. Like, you're looking at things because of little margins and little fringes and little, like, if you are, like, the thing that I've started really understand in the last 3 or 4 years is the most important thing that you can spend time, effort, and money on to improve your photography is you. It's either traveling somewhere interesting or beautiful to shoot landscapes or shoot wildlife, or taking courses to learn to better composition or color theory, or exposure to something that you don't normally shoot. So, like, I don't shoot people hardly at all, except for me in these videos, really. And I would get far more value out of taking a class that taught me how to shoot people than I would get on spending $3,000 on a lens or $6,000 on a body or whatever. If you are already the absolute pinnacle top tier of your game photography, and I'm not talking like, I mean, everybody's probably seen the curve where it's like how good you are versus how good you think you are, and there's this hill in the middle where you think you're really good, but you're, you think you're, whatever. I don't remember the exact drawing, but you think you're really good, but you're not. And then you go into the phase where you start thinking everything you do shit and everybody else thinks it's great because you actually have gotten to the point where you could be critical of yourself, and you're actually being super hypercritical of yourself. And then eventually you get good to the point where you are both critical of yourself and you know that it's a good picture and it's recognized by others as a good picture. Unless you're at that point in the curve where you're just good, the margin you're getting out of 10 frames a second more for shooting sports, or tenth of a stop or half of the stop more dynamic range, or pick a feature, any feature. It's not, that's where that really ends up playing. If you can't compose a picture to save your life, at least that's how I feel a lot of the time, having 20 stops of dynamic range isn't going to make your photography any better. You have to get better before that extra capability in the camera is going to help you. And that's, like I said, where I really start when I start looking at what's on the market now, who does what. Yeah, okay, Sony takes the lead for maybe a couple months. Who knows what Canon comes out with in the R1 in the end of the year, or Sony or Nikon has in the Z9, and da 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 da. Next year, year after that, it's all going to change again. There's going to be another something. Somebody's going to change. Somebody's going to do something, and autofocus is going to be different, or Canon. The rumor is the R1 will have a quad pixel AF, so it'll be sensitive to focus in all directions, and a global electronic shutter with no loss of dynamic range. And that would put the R1, as far as I'm concerned, not needing a mechanical shutter at all, ahead of everything. Like, that's it. Like, that's the pinnacle in some respects of, I don't give up anything and I don't have a mechanical part that breaks in my camera. That's a pinnacle or a big step forward kind of thing. And then Sony next year will have something new and it'll be better, and things switch, talk about Sony. And then Nikon, hopefully, will come out with something that's really interesting, and we'll be talking about the Nikon and how their camera's better than the Canon from 2 years ago and the Sony from 2 years ago, or whatever. And it's like, it's this round and round back and forth thing. And for me, so the things are, first of all, who's got a platform you like? Because if a 28-70 f2 is a cool lens to you, which is kind of why I even considered buying one, Sony ain't your platform. Nikon ain't your platform. You're talking about Canon. If if you look at what Sony's got for lenses for the Alpha platform, and you go, they're not fast enough, or that they don't have the tilt shift I want, or whatever it is, how much do you want to bet, and say Canon has it or Nikon has it, like if a 95 or 58 f.09 or 0.95 is your song, and Nikon's got it, maybe that's where you kind of end up really needing to be, because when it comes to 24-70 f2.8s and 70-200 f2.8s and whatever, everybody's got them. You're not really getting anything. Sony's is 0.5% better at this, and Nikon's is 2% better at that, and Canon's is 2% or 1% better at something else. Like, that's all a wash. The other thing is ergonomics. And this is one of those, again, it's a hugely personal thing, ergonomics. You are the person who has to use the camera. And all of the technology considerations aside, if you are not comfortable or efficient, or every time you use the camera you just get frustrated because this button's in the wrong place or this dial's in the wrong place or it's a pain, too much of a pain to get to some feature you use, not a good idea, not a good design, not a good fit for you. This is part of one of the problems. I think I touched on this at the beginning of the stream when I was talking about switching to Nikon. This is part of one of the problems that I had looking at Nikon. I don't like their ergonomics. I don't like the way their controls are laid out. I don't like the way their zoom and focus dials turn. Not that I couldn't get used to them, but I'm going to be frustrated with it probably for as long as I possibly, could use it. I really get along, like Canon's ergonomics, and it's really weird because I thought 5D Mark IV, best camera I'd ever used. Ergonomics, buttons, controls, things are exactly where I wanted them. And I was looking, like when the EOS R was announced, and I was looking at when the R5 was announced, and when I ordered the R5, and in the entire time until I got the R5, and I was sitting there going, man, this is going to be bad. Like, I'm going to hate this camera. Canon moved things. The buttons are in the wrong place. The Mark IV was so good. And I got the R5, and having 3 dials is, I won't say life-changing, but it's been almost like that for me. Like shutter, ISO, aperture, or for me, usually it's aperture, ISO, and exposure compensation on dials, and I basically don't have to touch buttons or go through menus when I'm shooting. All the shooting controls that I need, everything, like where I would have to hit the ISO button or use the little thumb switch I had programmed on the on my Mark IVs to do ISO, where I had to like constantly sort of make adjustments there, or use auto ISO, but then I didn't always like where auto ISO was putting me because I wasn't in control in times, and it would, but R5 is like way better. Even the usability is way better for me than the Mark IV was. And like, for me, it's a thing, it just clicks. I don't expect anybody else to just click. I don't expect anybody else to, just, that's what they want, and I perfectly expect that there are people who the ergonomics for Sony's cameras is like spot on for them. In which case, they should buy a Sony camera. But going back to why I'm talking about this, my situation, I don't see enough in anything Sony's got going right now to make me want to move from Canon. Especially given that Canon is currently demonstrating that they actually can compete, that it may have taken them a while, but unlike most of the people on the internet, I don't think Canon was so clueless and dumb from 2008 to 2015 or something that they just didn't understand cameras anymore, and they couldn't have the market, R&D money to compete and blah, blah, blah. I think what was happening is we were seeing that's what it looks like when a company shifts course, especially when it's a major consumer electronics thing and it's requiring a major shift in direction. Because they went from uncompetitive, if you will, in the 2010, 2012-ish time frame to having class-leading dynamic range in the R5, even though people won't admit to that. They still want to say it's not. Having essentially, I would argue, the best sensor-based autofocus technology in dual pixel AF, because you don't have to process out autofocus pixels that otherwise weren't there, and the whole thing works. Sony and Nikon are still talking contrast-based autofocus, phase plus contrast-based autofocus, and with Canon, as far as I can tell, there's no contrast-based autofocus happening. It's all phase-based all the time, and it works darn good. So, again, you know, not to, you know, you know, this is even one of those things too, right? Photography is a creative process. And I always, like, I never thought I'd ever say this with a straight face, but there is, I have found a level in whether or not the gear inspires you to do something. And if you're happy using it and you find it inspiring to use and it does something cool for you and gets you excited to go out and take pictures, well, that's not a bad thing. And, you know, whatever brand floats your boat. I mean, you got to do what makes, like, if you're a photographer, the thing that you produce is a picture. And the picture should be compelling and inspiring and evoke an emotional connection with the person who's looking at it. What you use to get there, who cares? Like, if the way you get there is Fuji or Sony or Panasonic or wet plate in a view camera that's 160 years old, as long as you're getting to that goal of producing a picture that inspires and connects with your audience, then you're doing something right. You're doing the important thing right. So, as I have now gone way longer rambling about Sony cameras than I ever thought I would, and probably far more fairly than I ever thought I would, because, like I said, not a big Sony fan here. I'm going to wrap this up here, call it a night. For those of you who are tuned in, thanks for watching. If you're watching this as a replay later, and you've made it this far, thanks for watching. Please, if you found this interesting, insightful, whatever, please smash that like button. If you're not subscribed, maybe consider subscribing. If you do subscribe, I don't post content as regularly as I'd like to. With the exception of this live stream, which I do Friday nights, but otherwise content comes up as soon as I can get it done. And it usually takes me a lot longer than other YouTubers to get content done because I try to make it good, or at least informative. And so you may want to smash that notification bell to get a notification of when the content is coming, or when the content goes up, just so it doesn't get lost in your stream. Anyway, as always, again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.